Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs. And the United States can shift the discourse from occupation to equality, from ending the occupation, decolonization, to democratization, to democracy. And then we'll have the same debate we had about South Africa. Should we engage with Israel to help democratize it, or should we be boycotting activities that Israel, well, fine, argue about that. That's a much better argument than arguing about whether we should have another Kerry initiative if the Democrats take the White House. That's what I'm arguing.
Ian, is the prospect, in your view, that somehow reality and pragmatism will stimulate democracy in Israel and Palestine, and among Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs? You offer an intriguing thought that because the current reality is so dysfunctional, it does not really reflect the interests that are not solely racial or ethnic of most of these people, and that they have other interests and common interests, and that those interest groups could coalesce ultimately into political groups, and that could create a political culture in which real interests supersede nationalism and ethnic racial vision.
So I'm not so sure that I want to say real versus unreal. People have interests, and those interests change as situations change, and who their allies are and who their enemies are also change. That's when you say politics makes strange bedfellows, that's actually a very deep fact about the world. I mean, you remember George Wallace. Now, you might have an image of George Wallace standing in front of the school of no segregation now, segregation forever. But he won his 4th term as governor kissing black babies. He became a full-fledged integrationist when he needed to in order to win elections. That is how politics works. When we went into Iraq and it conquered that country, terrible thing that we did, we had a country there where the Sunnis and the Kurds and the Shia are at each other's throats. By the time, at a certain point, the Shia were dominating the whole country. And what happened? What happened was that now the Shia hate each other. You got groups in there tearing themselves to pieces. What happens? That's typical. You change the structure of the situation, and people who see themselves as allies can start seeing themselves actually not as allies, but as opponents. When you think about the United States, and we could do this with Britain also, with the Irish, when you think about the United States, and think about the Democratic Party, blacks in America were excluded from the New Deal because Roosevelt relied on white Southern Democratic votes. That has changed, hasn't it? Now no Democrat has a prayer of being elected to the White House without a massive turnout of blacks. What happens? Well, when you have a democratic elements in your society, and I said Israel has it, and we had it in the United States. It's not clear that you could ever call the United States a democracy in the 19th century. Half the population, i.e. the women, could not vote. You still call it a democracy? Yes, it had democratic elements, we'll call it a democracy. Well, look at the way that happens. Some whites start to have interest in mobilizing blacks because they need their votes, just like some men in the late 19th and early 20th century in Western states saw that they could win elections against their opponents if they advocated letting the women vote. That's how minorities, formerly despised or excluded groups, get included in democracies over long periods of time. We've heard this phrase about the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Well, I'll change it a little bit. The arc of history is long, but in democratically oriented societies, it bends toward the inclusion of formerly despised and excluded groups, because they're a constant opportunity for mobilization by those within the dominant group that have, because the split, there are always splits, and there are plenty, I'm not sure if it's more, but it's almost as many Jews in Israel have more in common with moderate progressive Palestinians than they do with Jews who are supporting the current government. So that kind of dynamic doesn't happen quickly. When you talk about democratizing an autocracy, it can be done very quickly. Overthrow the old leader, write a new constitution, and boom, you've got a democracy. But that's not the kind of democratization that South Africa went through, or that Britain went through when it had to deal with a huge Irish Catholic majority it had because it annexed Ireland in 1801. It's not the kind the United States had to deal with when it all of a sudden had all these freed blacks who were supposed to go back to Africa, according to Abraham Lincoln. He never imagined that he was fighting the Civil War in order to create a multiracial democracy in America. But, as I say in the book, man tracht und God lacht. Man plans and God laughs. And so often that's the way democracy works. And I am saying that we have to take that kind of long view. This is a kind of democratization that doesn't mean that you and I are going to see what Moses saw. We may see it, we're not going to be there, okay? We're not going to see the two-state solution sign and, oh, it's wonderful. No, we're not going to have that pleasure. But we can have confidence and we can have satisfaction by fighting now for what is just and right and democratic, because we, instead of displacing our interest to a idol of an institutional framework, we want two states. No, I want 13 cantons. No, I want a confederation. No, I want parallel states. Forget it. Those are just pretty pictures. Pretty pictures aren't solutions. Solution is a picture of the future that you have a way to get to that's better than the past, than the present. What I am saying is take a longer view, say, I want to work for what honors the principles I believe in: democracy, equality, and mutual rights to non-exclusive self-determination. Anything that's good for that, I'll work for. If you indulge me, I'll give you one very clear example of what I mean, because you may think this is all airy-fairy stuff. One of the things I've been writing about since I lived there in 1969 is Jerusalem. I've really published a lot in some of the journals represented here. I have published articles about Jerusalem in different ways. As you know, about 300,000 Jerusalem's inhabitants of Greater Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that Israel drew after the 67 war, that include 70 square kilometers of the West Bank, are inhabitants of Yerushalayim, but they are not citizens of Israel, because Israel never annexed East Jerusalem. It only expanded the boundaries of the municipality of Yerushalayim. So the Arabs who lived in there became citizens of the city, not citizens of the country. But that means they can vote in municipal elections. And in the last election, the far right candidate beat the left moderate candidate by 3,000 votes. But only a pitiful small number of Arabs voted, because the PA has been telling them, don't vote because you will legitimize the occupation and postpone the two-state solution. Of course, actually the PA has its own very, very selfish reasons for this, but there's a lot of intimidation and force that goes into that. 22% of Arabs in East Jerusalem said they wanted to vote. Only fewer than 5% voted. For the first time, there was an Arab party running. It had a candidate for mayor, got 3,000 votes. Had even a fraction of those Arabs voted who wanted to, the mayor of Jerusalem would now be a left-wing progressive. And it would have been a signpost for what can come in the future. But it did not happen because people were still stuck to the idea, we have to do this in order to sustain the two-state solution. Instead of thinking that, think, well, what's democratic? What's good for equality? What's good for raising the standards of living and protecting the interests of those hundreds of thousands of Arabs who live in misery and discrimination in the eastern sector of the city? You see, that's what I'm talking about. And so many things, once you do this gestalt, they look different. You don't worry so much, oh my God, E1 might be settled. What are we gonna do? It'll be the end of the two-state solution. Forget it, it's done. Let them settle E1. Let them it doesn't matter. There's fewer settlers, there are fewer Jews living in the Galilee. More opportunities for Arabs there to build a life and to use resources.
And cynics would respond to your prediction that all of this will take a long time and say that, well, in a long time we're all dead, and that in the meantime, here are two societies who have their own dangerous, fanatic components. State of Israel, that is a military superpower with nuclear weapons, that this is a very volatile, dangerous situation as history has demonstrated in the past. There's also the element of demography, and however committed Israeli Jews may be to democracy, there is also that lingering fear that if there is, and there probably will be, an Arab majority in greater Israel-Palestine, whatever the evolution of these processes toward democracy and pluralism are, there's also the fear that they will be engulfed by the other side. Also, isn't it also likely that in other countries where efforts have been made to change from the kind of tyranny that has kept down the weaker side of the populace, that when democratic movements emerge, that the governments will change the rules, and that restriction on voting, legal bars which will put a brake on or defeat democratic change will intervene.
For example, Jim Crow. Okay, that's what was done in the United States, to do just that. You think blacks are going to be represented in Congress? The Republicans pushed for black enfranchisement quickly so they would win the election, and it worked. And the 1876 election was won by the Democrats for the president, but in order to get rid of the rules in the South that produced Republican Congress, they agreed to allow their candidate not to be president. So we have this, just what you said in the United States, the government rigged, that's what Jim Crow was, to make it impossible for blacks to exercise their rights. How long did it take to overcome that? Okay, but it was still not completely overcome. 100 years? My point exactly. This is a very slow process. Now you can say, oh my God, there are people who will say you can't wait that long. This is very dangerous. Israel's nuclear weapon. Well, guess what? That's an argument that many people make by using the word must. I want you to think about that word must. There must be a two-state solution. Why? Well, is it must because you can't tolerate the idea of it without that? It's must because psychologically or morally I can't accept it? That's one meaning of must? Or is it because the way the world is put together by God and Einstein, it must happen this way? It has to. It's inevitable. You see, what happens when somebody says must is they smuggle both meanings in. And it's a tragic fact that they don't go together. There's no guarantee they go together. So although I may feel, or you may feel, there must be a two-state solution because there are two different societies, they hate each other, whatever, and Israel has nuclear weapons, it doesn't mean that there must be in the sense that it will automatically happen. The world contains a great deal of tragedy, and it's not available to us to hide within that word must. One of the articles I published recently in Middle East Policy, I know Ann is here, and Joyce, was on the red thread of demography. Israel and the red thread of demography, and showing how it really was for Zionism, the heart of the argument from the very beginning. And it never goes away, it's always there, this fear of demography. And here I've said, well, guess what, folks, there are more Arabs than Jews west of the Jordan. But what I want to focus your attention on now, and what my book tries to do with the shift in Gestalt, is the demographic argument. Progressives like me use the demographic argument for decades to try to address Israelis who were afraid of Arabs, who despised them, who feared them. So why are you supporting settlements? So why are you supporting Begin and Shamir in the attempt to keep the territories? You don't want to live with Arabs, do you? All you like, you want those Arabs involved in the country? Don't you want a Jewish state? That's people like me talking. We were using the demographic argument for what we thought were progressive purposes. And it was a deal with the devil. And it didn't work. Okay? It didn't work. And all of us probably felt, many of us at least, felt, this is not really a very nice thing to be doing. My mother would not approve. But we did it. Now, I want you to think about what the implications of continuing to use the demographic argument are by progressives when there is no hope of getting a two-state solution by doing it. Instead, what you are doing is you are telling Israelis who ultimately should be in alliances, Mizrahim, as Jews from Asian and African countries, or immigrants from Ethiopia, you are telling them, you could never have an alliance with Arabs, because they're Arabs. That's what you're doing when you use a demographic argument. You are postponing, undercutting the very mechanisms that can, in the future, democratize the country and bring the kind of country that you want. Now, what does that mean? And here's the hard truth for many Israeli Jews, is it means no, it's not going to be a Jewish state. What nobody except Kahana ever actually clearly said what a Jewish state means. But because what it meant for most Israelis is a state that operates in order to help one section of society against the other, to help Jews as opposed to Arabs, and to do so with the capability to front itself as a democracy. That's what Israel as both a Jewish and a democratic state means. That's the actual meaning. That's not possible anymore. That will not be possible. That is, if you try to work within that, where a state dominates Arabs at their expense for the sake of the Jews, you are going to subsidize the domination of the country by the clericalist right. That's what it really means. So the demographic argument that used to be progressive is now very regressive. And that's another example of what I mean by when you switch the gestalt, you choose a new paradigm, a new way to look at the problem, a lot of things look very different than they did before.
Let's open it up to the audience, and Ian, could you respond to anyone?
Sure.
Can I ask people to identify themselves because we're on video?
Please keep your questions short and put them in the form of a question.
So just going back to what you said earlier, is your argument in the book that pro-Israel lobby is one of the motivating factors for why the Israeli right is in power? And if that is your argument, don't you think there are a lot of other factors, like internal to Israeli politics, that could also be?
Yes, thank you. Not motivating. It's not the motivating. It's the structure of competition in Israel. Yes, there are ideological, demographic, Mizrahim hate the Ashkenazim for the things that were done to them, all kinds of internal Israeli reasons, and natural revanchism, beliefs that, yes, Judea and Samaria, it's ours, God gave it to us, all kinds of internal reasons. Just as there are all kinds of internal reasons why Israelis would have opposed that and favored, as people, as so many Israeli leaders and generals have, that is, favored getting out of the West Bank and Gaza. Those are all there in Israel. The question is, what impact did the unquestioned and only unprecedented flood of aid and political support from the United States that was due to the lobby vetoing wiser, more realistic, or more national interest-oriented policies, what effect did that have on this competition in Israel? And what it did was it systematically disadvantaged the positions, arguments, and programs of people like Yossi Sarid or Yossi Balin or Shua Mitoloni, and systematically, and Yigal Alon, or even Moshe Dayan in his time, and systematically supported those who were going to indulge in fantastic messianic expansionist dreams that were very inspiring, but that's how you got Begin and Shamir and Netanyahu. And why, and to say nothing of Gush Emunim, how their ability to say we can have the whole land and American support. The lobby made that possible, thereby undercutting the left and subsidizing the right. So it wasn't the motivation involved. Is that clear? Okay. Yes.
Thanks very much to Ian and Phil and Lara. This is fascinating. As soon as I mark my students' papers, I'll be reading the book. I want to somewhat, well, first of all, as you probably know, it's a situation of the emperor's new clothes. Everyone, or almost everyone, advocating 2 states from the left knows that it won't work, but they don't have a vision. And my question to you, you say you dismissed confederation and other ideas. I've been taken by some of the settlers, disciples of Rabbi Foreman, who are surprisingly were very progressive, amazingly so in their views. They provide a vision of a Jewish state, which also means one state in many ways. Don't you think some sort of vision that Jews can hold onto is worth advocating?
Yes. It's a quick yes, I will. So there is an emperor's new clothes aspect to this whole situation. I completely agree, and I like taking off. I mean, ever since I was in third grade and I read that story, yeah, I want to be the guy. And so I've done that, I admit it. But what Paul is also noting is that there are ideas such as confederation, and there are ideas fostered by small groups of settlers in the West Bank, disciples of Rabbi Fruman and others, who have adumbrated an image or a vision of the country as some kind of Jewish state, but where Arabs are happily living. There are a lot of varieties of that. I want to say, and I do agree, yes, let 100 visions develop. The vision documents that were produced by Arab Israelis should not be seen as infuriating manifestos. They should be seen as visions of a future that can incorporate not just Arabs and Jews within the Green Line. That's exactly right. Let's have a competition among more realistic visions that are founded on principles of equality and democracy and non-exclusivist rights for self-determination, whether that's binationalism or whether that's a kind of Jewish Arab society or a kind of Jewish state that defines itself in a way that doesn't deprive non-Jews of opportunities for self-determination. That's fine, and I know those groups, I know other groups. I want to say one thing about the Confederation, parallel state, 2 homelands in 1 state, that I've actually participated in that discourse also. One of the problems when you look closely at them, and I have looked very closely at them, is that when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, they don't quite know what to do. For example, in parallel states one, can Arabs who move to Haifa from the West Bank, retaining Palestinian citizenship in Palestine, now they're living in Haifa, can they vote in Haifa municipal elections? Can they vote in Haifa municipal elections? Which would, they won't answer that question, because it's very interesting, it would actually integrate it. What I also know is that the way to get there, they say, is through negotiations between Jews and Arabs. That's the thing that I don't think can work, because because when you look at it closely, it really is two states. The idea of a confederation is two states that agree. So it's just a two-state solution with a complex set of rules around it. So my argument is that a negotiated route to two-state solution between Jews and Arabs, that's what's not possible, whether you call it a confederation or not.
Thank you, very interesting. Okay, Diane Perlman, Transcend and School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. I'm wondering what you're familiar with Johann Galtung's idea of six-state solution modeled on the Middle East community and the organization and security in the Middle East. And just another part two of that is, as you know, last month I was at the UN for the first conference on a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, which of course was boycotted by the US and Israel. Some of the countries were bashing Israel and US, others were inviting them and looking to have them participate in the future. So just your thoughts about how that plays into this.
Well, unfortunately, although I read John's proposal, I can't remember it in detail now. There are many of these proposals of, as you said, there's 13 cantons, 6 states. The right wing in Israel has been, I could have to say, imaginative, but extraordinarily unrealistic in their ideas of, okay, we're gonna move the Gazan refugees to Sinai, and Egypt's gonna take, and then the West Bank refugees will go to Jordan, and Jordan will go, all this stuff. There's all these pretty pictures, including the ones that I have. I have a pretty picture in my head of 2 states. And remember, Ireland seceded from Great Britain, from the United Kingdom in 1920. So you had a 2-state solution, not Loan Plan, because Belfast didn't go, but you had a 2-state solution after 120 years of annexation. Britain ruled, occupied Ireland for hundreds of years before 1800, then it annexed it, wouldn't give rights to the Irish Catholics to vote for another 20 to 70 years, depending on how much money you had. Then they got the vote, and it took 30 years to actually become a dominant force in British politics, then fought an intifada and got a 2-state solution. So I'm not saying that there won't be ever 2 states. I'm just saying that a negotiated route to it now is not possible. And politics never ends. I'm for annexation. I'm for annexation, for anything toward that, because it will shift the discourse and the kind of struggles toward the important ones, which is equality and democracy for all. And whether that results ultimately, eventually in 2 states, I don't know. I don't want to worship the picture of the future. Jerome and Gary?
If we could take maybe 3 questions at once, like a group of them, or is that
Okay.
Yeah, just because there's so many.
Yeah.
Jerome Siegel, Jewish Peace Army. I must say, I never really get it when people say that they can't see a pathway to a 2-state solution. I mean, it's a question of whether or not, whether or not the stars are aligned right, and the 3 stars are the US, the Palestinians, and the Israelis. And there are changes in all of these things. Right now, it seems to me that things are heading in the right direction. We're heading to the end of the Netanyahu era. We're heading to the end of the Trump era. And Hamas is moving in the direction, I think, of responsibilities. So let me put it as a question, a very specific question. Right? The last time there was a real shot, at least in the judgment of the Palestinian negotiators and the Israeli negotiators, at a negotiated settlement was the Olmert negotiations. Very serious. And Abu Mazen came out of that believing that if they had more time, that they would have been able to work it out. Olmert resigned because of his political problems. So my question to you is really, what fundamentally has changed since Olmert, that if we got a post-Netanyahu government in Israel, makes it impossible, let's say with a Sanders presidency and whatever, to have a negotiated settlement.
Hi, Mara Redmond, former student. I want to ask a question a little that starts from where we are now, and goes from your point about politics, and everyone's politics. So if you were not a political scientist, but one of the current candidates, and you wanted to have a hope of actually prevailing in the coming election in this country, understanding the populist wave all over the world, and the fact that the majority of Israeli Jews right now would favor a Jewish state over a democracy, and frankly, very frightening polls in the United States about relative respect for rule of law, how would you position where you think things should go for Israel for a candidate?
Alright,
Okay?
those are big, yeah.
All right, good. First of all, Jerry is actually absolutely the right person to ask the question he asked. I have a whole Jerry Siegel file. And I didn't include it in the book. What it is every setback, Jerry's got another way to solve it. And even though the old way no longer is possible, there's a new way, and the stars are aligned, so it could be done this way. And I am not surprised, and am actually gratified that you still are seeing a way. But you might not be right. And as the possibility that you're not right decreases, the possibility that delusion or entertaining that possibility is actually playing a sucker's game into what the right wants, which is a constant feeling of that carrot, that maybe we'll get 2 states, and meanwhile, you're sinking the whole thing into decades and decades and decades of apartheid. If I were a cartoonist, I would have published in the Israeli press the following cartoon. There's a wagon being drawn by a donkey, and Netanyahu is in the driver's seat. And the donkey says the Israeli peace movement on it. and the sign says, it's pointing toward apartheid. And Netanyahu is holding a carrot in front of the donkey. And on the carrot, it says, 2-state solution. He's holding the carrot, his Bar Ilan speech, which was completely phony, in order to get the whole system just going toward what is really apartheid, where it thinks, oh, but I'm gonna get the carrot. No, it's not gonna get the carrot. What has changed is that for one thing, if you look at Rahm Emanuel, he gave to Obama in 2009 the exact same advice that I gave to George H.W. Bush and to Jimmy Carter. Exactly the same, which is focus on the settlements, take a strong American stand on those settlements. It'll split Israeli politics, and you'll get a reaction that will be more tractable toward a 2-state solution. It kind of was true when I was given the advice, and that partly resulted in Baker's speech to AIPAC, to the loan guarantees, and to the victory of the Labour Party in the 1992 elections, and to the Oslo. It didn't, maybe it had a 30% chance if you ran the computer program 100 times, 30 times it would have ended in success. It didn't. Now, the difference is that when Rahm Emanuel gave that advice to Obama, not only was the lobby much stronger, but there was no shadow government in Israel. No government capable of winning an election on that issue. So Netanyahu could just play America like he does a piano, and he even said that. And Ephraim Halevi, I quote him as saying, I heard him say this, he says, it's one thing, it's easy, it's tough to, Russia's not like the United States. The United States, you can do whatever you want with. It's easy to move them. Russia, that's another problem. Okay, Mara. It's an interesting question. What would I say if I were a candidate? I probably would say more or less what I told Ross Perot when he said he was going up in the polls and he had no policies on any issues. And he had to speak to a Jewish group in New York. And so he called me, believe it or not, to Dallas to teach him about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Oh my God. Yes, it was a wild encounter. And I listened to him, And at the end, and also his advisors, and I tried to teach him about things, and at the end of the day, they asked me, so what do I think he should say? And I said, actually, he doesn't know enough to say anything substantive. He should stay away from this topic, but if he's asked, there's one thing he can say. I support any agreement that the Jews and Arabs will agree on. And now I would say the same thing, except I would add, what I want in Israel-Palestine is something that Jews and Arabs can live with and that honors the principles of democracy, equality, and non-exclusivist rights to self-determination for all peoples. That's the position I would take. That's not a position that any of the candidates have taken, even Bernie Sanders, who are still hiding within the idea of a two-state solution because they can get away with that politically, and that's all that matters at that level of American politics, because they know they're not gonna actually get anything in the Middle East, and if they did, nobody, none of their constituents would care. But what does matter is are they gonna get killed politically, domestically? That's always, and so right now, the two-state solution is nothing but a safe harbor, something that you can attach yourself to look respectable and safe from the Israel lobby. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm yeah, okay, I'm Ross Anthony, I'm from Rand Corporation. We're just finishing a study looking at the alternatives to a two-state solution. So I identify with a lot that you said. And maybe what's interesting is if you look at these focus groups, the number one thing that Israeli Jews want is to continue to be a Jewish state. And we can, number two is they want to be a democracy, number three, they want all the land, so those things don't work together. But if I'm not as patient as you are, how do I get to what you're throwing out? Because what a one-state solution to most Israeli Jews means is something that's skewed in a way that maintains Jewish control. How do I get to this idea that you're putting out in the stars? How long do I have to wait? And if I'm not really very patient, how do I get there? And it's probably true. First of all, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and so I identify that, but I'm also from Oklahoma too, so
Sorry about that.
That is too bad.
I'd like to take the democratization back from the distant future to the current election in
Yes.
Israel. And we're in for a third election, and doesn't look like there's much chance of a change unless the Blue Party, whatever it is, accepts the offer of the one list. Now, unless we can get that kind of democratization where we at least give and overturn the nationality law, unless we can get even the Israeli citizens or Palestinians democratized, shouldn't that be a first step?
Good, terrific questions. I am not a one-state solution. Don't code me that way, because I am not suggesting I know the route to get there. What we have is a one-state reality. Whether you think it's a solution or not is up to you. For Netanyahu, this more or less is a solution. Okay? Pretend that you might negotiate something in the future, but actually dominate a situation where Arabs have zero rights and where Jews still are locked in to things we can't deal with Arabs. Yes, that's right. That's what Jews will say. We want a Jewish state. But what you want is not what you ultimately get, because often, the whole theme of the book is the unintended consequences of taking more than you can handle. In this case, the unintended consequences of creating a situation where you can't get rid of the West Bank and Gaza from under your control means that you won't have a Jewish state, whether you like it or not. Now, I'm sorry to say that that's going to take time. However, your question points to the possibility that things could go faster than I anticipated. If it weren't for the impeachment, I would have been on NPR already. I had an NPR interview on Point for this book, and then the impeachment happened, and they said, sorry. Well, the news in Israel is a little better for the book, because just what I'm talking about has been happening. Here you have these blue and white right-wing generals who are saying before the first election, one thing you can be sure of, us, like to have us. And we will deal with Gaza the way they should be, and we will never ally ourselves with Arabs. And then you get a political situation in which, wait a minute, the only way Gantz could be prime minister is maybe on the outside. He has a deal and he goes to the Arabs and he talks to them. This is good. And now one of the things that's changed for people like me who have obsessively watched Israeli politics for 50 years, noticing that at first, when they do polling, they didn't even interview the Arabs. Then they do polling and they don't say they interviewed the Arabs. Then they do polling but only report the Jewish, but report it as Israeli. Then eventually they say, well, among Jews and among, if you add the Arabs, and then when they report the possibilities of coalition, it used to be right, left, and then the Arabs. Now, partly in order for the news to be able to make itself interesting, it says there's the right-wing bloc and the left-center bloc. And guess who's the biggest party in the left-center bloc, the second biggest party? The Arabs. Now that's the unintended consequence of an attempt to destroy the Arab parties by raising the threshold to exclude all of them, but they just combine. Again, notice how democracy in the ferocious attempt to gain power and protect your influence leads you to do things you never said you would do or want. Okay, so that's one of the nice things. You remember when we were kids and Coppertone showed us these beautiful tans? Wow, we want a tan like that. Now Coppertone sells itself to keep you white. All right? And, oh, things, so things change. What you want changes.
Hi, Stephen Cook from the Council on Foreign Relations. I don't really think of myself as a former grad student, once a student, always a student. I am fascinated by this idea of Holocaustia. And it seems that much of your argument hinges on this idea. Now I want to use your language from a class way back in the late 1990s. Where does, I'm tripped up on this issue of time, because Holocaustia over time becomes institutionalized. It becomes a hegemonic idea, it becomes common sense for Jewish Israelis.
Yes.
Where does the counter-hegemonic idea come from that undermines Holocaustia?
Terrific question. And
I was trained well.
yes, well, remember I said there were 4 constructions of the Holocaust in Israeli politics? I actually published a double article about this in 2017 in a journal called Contemporary Jewry. And you can see by the 10-page attack on me that was published alongside of the article by the editors, for the editors, just how sensitive this topic is. But, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, but the answer is that there's actually, if I have to say so myself, a beautiful answer to your question. Around the time of the Eichmann trial, there were progressives who generated a new curriculum in Israel to teach about the Holocaust as a moral object lesson, and use Nuremberg. And under Shulamit Aloni, Yossi Sari, when they were in charge of the Education and Culture Ministry, that curriculum made progress. So there's this construction that is present in Israeli politics of that, seeing the Holocaust not as a template for Jewish life, but as a lesson for humanity. The fact that Holocaustia has been hegemonically established, and you're absolutely correct, it has, means that people in Israel cannot escape, Jews, but even Arab Jews cannot escape thinking in Holocaustia terms. So but the unintended consequence of that is what happens when a picture is distributed of Israeli soldiers at a checkpoint forcing an Arab to play the violin. What happens when Breaking the Silence talks about the Arabs under supervision of Israeli soldiers forced to eat dirt or sing IDF songs about the units that are beating them? What happens when young Arabs trying to get food are dragged from tunnels, trying to escape the Gaza ghetto? What happens is what Ari Shavit said happened to him when he was a guard in the first Intifada at a detention facility in Gaza. He felt like a German, and he saw the Palestinians as Jews. That is the counter-hegemonic element. You have already the formula. One of the things I stress in the book, and there are order forms back, discount order forms back there, just go, anyway. That's the key, that under the right circumstances, that can make a comeback. This struggle, this mimetic struggle among the four constructions, even though one of them did achieve hegemony, doesn't mean it's hegemonic forever. And I see the inability of Israelis, Yair Golan, the deputy chief of staff, compared Israel to Nazi Germany as his greatest fear. That is now considered an illegal act, but Israeli minds can't help but do it because everything, including Palestinian suffering, is seen through that lens. So you see the way the unintended consequences are operating that mechanism. Mantra, God luck.
All right, I think this might be our last group of questions.
You choose them.
We'll start back here. Hi, my name's Marissa. About 4 or 5 years ago, when I was your research assistant, we had talked quite a bit about democratization and whatnot, but figured I'd ask some clarification. The way that democratization is being discussed, it almost sounds very eerily similar to what was de-Arabization and secularization of the Mizrahim when they were brought into Israel in the 1950s until the 1960s. And in the sense, it was very much framed as as this whole pluralistic, universalist idea of we're going to make everyone, brought in. However, it ended up basically subjugating and essentially creating massive inequalities that still exist today. When you're talking about the center left and you're talking about Yossi Beilin, who, quite frankly, they are in many ways more, more anti-Mizrahi than the right wing, how exactly does that work out then with democratization when they are inherently opposed to a majority of the population? How do you see that working out, especially when those people are not actually democratic?
So
We're gonna take a couple more, hold on.
Those people as Arabs or as?
The center left, the center left.
Okay, we're gonna take a couple more questions, this is the last round, so Kristen, just, at your pleasure.
There's one area you really haven't touched much about. Of course, many of the Arab countries are aligned in different ways with the United States. I'd like you to say a word, if some of the policies you're enunciating could be put in motion, how you would involve the Arab states, the Egypts, the Saudi Arabias, the Lebanons, of course the Jordans, and of course Iran is floating around there. So talk to that greater surround and how this plays into this.
Last one.
Yeah, last one. I want to dispute what you say, the reality on the ground is one state solution. My name is Asaf Esha. I do not see any one state. I see in the reality 2 states. Gaza is a state, except for security border. The West Bank Palestinian Authority has its own state. Moreover, there are negotiations between the Israelis and the Gazan and the Egyptian about 5-year ceasefire. So the reality on the ground is moving toward 2-state solution. I think it's much better than it used to be. One state. Israel is encircled with 1-state solution. Syria is a 1-state solution with many nationality. Lebanon is also a 1-state solution. Jordan is a 1-state solution. This is what you have in mind?
Again, just in reverse order. I'm not saying it's a solution, it's a reality, and you and I differ. When I say one state, I'm a political scientist. What is a state? A state is an apparatus of power that enforces property rights. That means that that if your life and your property is at risk because of an entity that calls itself a state, that's your state. If the Palestinian Authority or Hamas can't protect West Bank Arabs or Gazan Arabs from Israeli destruction of their house or expropriation of their land, then the state that rules them is not the PA or Hamas, it is Israel. It may rule them the way a prison is ruled. If you have a prison inside the Green Line, and it's filled with Palestinian prisoners, inside the prison yard, the state of Israel does not control everything that goes on. It works through the prisoner organizations. There are PLO, PFLP, PFLP, Hamas. That doesn't mean that's not inside the state of Israel. It is. And Gaza is a big prison in which Hamas takes care of a lot of what Israel cannot or doesn't want to do. So and if you look at the way the Central Bureau of Statistics, for example, it says how many Jews are living in Israel. The answer to that question is all the Jews living west of the Jordan River. That is, whether you live in the West Bank or inside in Tel Aviv, you're living in Israel. And in almost all areas of Israeli life, that is how things are treated. When Israel makes a change in its law or decides to shut down the city of Ramallah because of what it considers a security problem, it doesn't ask permission from the PA. It just does it. When it passes legislation that affects all the inhabitants of the West Bank, it doesn't check first with the PA. It just does it because it is the state there, even if it uses different rules to be the state than it uses in Galilee and Tel Aviv. I've got two other quick, the Arab states. Well, one thing is, I think Egypt can play a very important role, though it's hard to trust anything that the current leadership in Egypt does, with respect to Gaza. In the long run, Egypt and Jordan and the Arab states should make it very clear that they support Palestinian rights, that they will not be an escape hatch for Israel to dump refugees on them, and that they stand for equality and democracy. Now, because that doesn't sound like a very realistic role, and you're right, because I don't see very many Arab states around who are in a position to do anything very helpful. But in principle, that's what they should be doing. As far as Marissa's question, I'm not sure I understood it all, but if you're suggesting that first comes an ideological or cultural commitment to democracy, and then comes a change in democratic habits, then I would agree with you that that's not going to happen. But that's not how I'm suggesting democratization actually changes. If we look at the immigration from the Muslim countries of the Mizrahi, when they came, there was this attempt that you are referring to of assimilating them, of deracinating them, of changing them into civilized Europeans, that alienated them and destroyed their sympathy for the labor elites that were doing this. That idea of pulverizing culturally a community and then changing it, had that not been done, and instead had opportunities to integrate into existing political parties on the basis of struggles for equal rights, I don't think you necessarily would have had what you had. Those struggles, bottom-up struggles, where Jews and Arabs find in their interest to ally with one another because of ecological issues, because of economic issues, because of inequality in Israel. Those are the basis upon which later, or just because you want to be in a coalition, that's the basis later for feeling, this is a multiracial democracy. If it weren't, we, i.e. the Democrats, would never get into power. It's a reverse process that I'm imagining.
So I want to intervene here. We have to wrap this up. I want to thank Ian. This was a tremendous discussion. Phil, thank you so much for leading it and provoking some real discussion and hard questions. I want to thank the audience. This was a very civil and far-reaching discussion. I think we could keep going for a couple of hours. I'm sorry that we can't. I will do a shout out. We have these flyers up on the table, which if you want to order the book,
20% discount.
I am very much looking forward to reading. I don't know how much time you have to hang around afterwards, but I know there's a lot of people who would still like to talk to you. So thank you very much on behalf of the Undercarry. And thank you, Leon, for hosting us here as usual. So, good afternoon.